It's time for the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith.
And welcome, brothers, sisters, working class heroes. This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for being here today on the big program. Lots to get to, lots to talk about. Something happened today in history. 1868 was the year the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted, known as the Reconstruction Amendment. What did it do? Well, it granted all persons born or naturalized in the United States of America citizenship, and also forbid states from denying them of life, liberty, property without due process of law. Also made sure that everyone was protected equally under the law. That was the intent. The intent was, as the slaves were being freed, they were citizens. They had protections under our Constitution. They were American citizens. So the question becomes, how did an amendment designed to grant citizenship to and protect the civil liberties of the recently freed slaves, how did that then morph into something that, well, is widely viewed as a protectorate for corporate America? And you could argue money. You could argue money. Did I mention money? Yeah, I mean, we have the best court money can buy, and for most of our history, it's been that way. There have been a few exceptions where, people actually were at the center of legal thought. But, the 14th Amendment, benefits corporations in huge ways because corporations are people. You know this now. It gives them equal protection with you and me. So we're equal with corporate America. Gives them due process. And what we know about our law is the one with the most money is the most equal. I guess that's the easy way of putting it. So if you're going up against, I don't know, let's say Boeing, who do you think has more equal? Who's got more money? Now, understand, equal protection under the law is important, but it's something that corporations like to cling on to, like due process rights. You can't do anything to those corporations, like, I don't know, regulate them. So you see the Roberts Court, and look, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just somebody who observes what's going on. You see the direction the Roberts Court is taking us, and it is back to the days where corporate America ruled the roost, where, the good old days of the 80s and 90s, if you will. And understand, corporations will defend their rights vigorously, especially from you and me wanting to regulate them. Because understand, 14th Amendment gives them contractual, guarantees. Corporations and people and everything can enter into contracts, and they're legally enforceable through our law, thanks to, that their 14th Amendment. And the reason I bring this up is, again, the more money you have, the more equal you are. I guess maybe the less blind justice is, maybe, because over the weekend we see that Boeing has agreed in principle to some additional fines because of all of the things that went on with, I don't know, with the birds flying out of the sky. You may remember back in 2021, as part of a deferred prosecution agreement, they agreed to pay like $2.5 billion in penalties back then. But then they had, a couple more, which got, the Department of Justice going, this ain't good. So now this latest rounds of, we're sorry, is going to come with about $455 million to strengthen compliance and safety programs, and about $487 million in penalties. They've agreed to some oversight. They're going to have like a regulator come in and walk around. Interestingly enough, this is a weird part, and I give this credit to the Biden DOJ. This is new. The agreement includes the families who died in crashes, the ability to meet with the board of directors at Boeing. Now, understand, none of them are going to jail. No CEO, none of them are going to jail. So don't get crazy. We're not that equal. But this is kind of a big deal in a sense. That there's going to be, I don't know, these board of directors are going to have to, for a minute or two, look at the victims of the families of the victims. It might make them feel uncomfortable for a second or two. Now, as I said, no jail time, nothing, no corporate death penalty, because we don't seem to do that. Now, if you were to kill a couple hundred people, that's the end of you. Corporate America does it. It's a fine. And I would argue we're in a moment where the 14th Amendment is under attack. There are conservatives who want to attack the 14th Amendment for that birthright citizenship thing. But corporate America is going to hold on to this because it's the basis of their whole personhood. It's what makes them, equal to you and me, or more equal. So the question again comes back to when we go to the polls and we vote, do we think about who they're going to appoint to the Supreme Court and how that court, because understand, we're going to find out just how powerful the court is and just what it means to our lives as this court repeals the 20th century. Do we think about what those outcomes in that court with those 9 folks in robes, how that's going to affect not just our lives, but the future of this country for our children? Interesting to think about. I want to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Gonna take a quick break. Right back.
We are AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. We represent 700,000 federal and D.C. government workers who are the vital threads of the fabric of American life. We support our nation's military. We take care of our nation's veterans. We protect our nation's borders. We respond to our nation's crises and natural disasters. We provide services to our nation's seniors. The American Federation of Government Employees. We work for America.
We are AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. We represent 700,000 federal and D.C. government workers who are the vital threads of the fabric of American life. We support our nation's military. We take care of our nation's veterans. We protect our nation's borders. We respond to our nation's crises and natural disasters. We provide services to our nation's seniors. The American Federation of Government Employees. We work for America.
You're listening to The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.
So yesterday on the program, we talked about the 121st anniversary of the March of the Mill Children. Mother Jones and about 100 child workers, some missing fingers, hands, arms, you name it. Marching from Philadelphia to Oyster Bay, New York, to highlight the fact that child labor in this country was really bad, really being abused, exploited, and sadly enough, the desperation of the family forced kids into the workplace because our economy was so badly mismanaged. And this is one of these things where I look at today. You go 121 years ago, we're much better than that. I don't know. We're heading in a weird direction when we got a lot of states across this country trying right now to loosen child labor laws. You've got a Supreme Court that appears to be wanting to repeal the 20th century. And here to share some thoughts on what that could look like and why maybe it's a bad idea, I've asked Joseph McCartin to come talk with us. Joseph's a professor of history at Georgetown University. He's the executive director of the Kalmanoff Institute for Labor and the Working Poor, also president of LACHA, the Labor and Working Class History Association. Joseph, thanks for taking time for us. Thank you very much for having me, Rick. Quite a resume you have there. It took me a while to get through it. But here's the thing. I'm amazed at how many people I talk to who don't think it's possible for the past to become the future. And I'll give you an example. We had done our Working Class Heroes tour a couple years ago, ended up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, did a coal mine tour. And the coal mine operator was explaining what the working conditions were like in the 1850s and how horrible they were. Knee deep in muck and feces and just horrible conditions. And the woman behind me said, "Well, where was OSHA?" So this mindset that
Right.
it is as it has always been and it always will be seems to be prevalent in our mind, and I think that's a huge mistake.
Oh, it's a huge mistake, Rick. But unfortunately, it's all too common. I think it's true about Americans in general that we tend to have more historical amnesia, I think, than other countries. But I think nowhere is that more true when it comes to the history of labor relations in this country. Fortunately, in a way, there are very few people living now who remember what it was like before the passage of the Wagner Act in 1935. And many people were born into a world in which there was an OSHA, there was an Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And they can't conceive that these things are not, immutable. They're not necessarily forever. And in fact, they're being seriously eroded all around us. And more rapidly so in the last few years, especially, I would say, by the actions of what I would call the most anti-labor Supreme Court we've had since the time Mother Jones was marching back in what we call the Lochner era of the court.
No, it's something we've talked about here on the program for years. And I've had people go, no, that can't possibly happen. Not here. And yet here we are with a Supreme Court who has shown us that there's no such thing as decided law anymore. That stare decisis thing that John Roberts said he agreed with and believed in doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem to be holding, because we saw Janus go by the wayside. We saw Roe go by the wayside. We saw the Chevron doctrine go. There seems to be a lot of precedent that seems to keep going by the wayside. And I fear the 20th century next.
Yeah, I mean, what just happened, for example, you referenced the demolishing of the Chevron doctrine, is a dagger pointed right at the heart of what the New Deal accomplished for Americans, which was creating a regulatory structure in the country that could vigorously protect people. And perhaps the cornerstone of that structure in the 30s was the National Labor Relations Act. Which allowed workers to organize, or at least many workers to organize for the first time, and protected their rights to do so. What we're now seeing is a Supreme Court that is determined to basically remove that right in all but name. And just as they did in their recent decision on presidential immunity, they sort of preserve the idea that there might possibly be areas in which presidents aren't immune. But the fact of how they've constructed their test more or less grants complete immunity. And the reverse is happening when it comes to labor relations. The decisions that they've made, including the recent one involving the Chevron doctrine, basically are tying the hands of agencies like the National Labor Relations Board and its use of administrative law judges to issue preliminary injunctions, for example, to stop employers from violating worker rights. So they are going after the New Deal state. They, in many ways, are trying to repeal the 20th century.
You talk about the old labor saying of which side are you on? Clearly, right now, the NLRA situation is a perfect example of that. You've got a handful of billionaires and extraordinarily powerful companies saying, we think this is bad for us. And then the rest of us should be going, no, we think we'd like to keep this. And we have a Supreme Court, I think, that will decide at some point. And I fear, as I've correctly feared in the past, that the court will side with the moneyed interest.
I think it's, almost a foregone conclusion that the court will do that, judging on its performance of late. But I think what I see in this court is a preferred way of, attacking the New Deal state, and that is not to overturn, the law completely. I would be somewhat surprised if they did for the Wagner Act what they did for Roe, which was to take it on and just completely overturn it. as they did in the Dobbs decision. Right. I think it's more likely that they're going to continue to chip away at all the mechanisms that were developed over time that made that law really work for workers. And for many years, we know, as we've been following this stuff, Rick, that, and I know you've covered it a lot, that our labor law is broken. It's broken as it is. And I would say that you could apply to the current situation a phrase that the Chicago teachers used when they were striking in 2012 about the school system of Chicago, that it was, quote, broke on purpose. And our labor law right now is broke on purpose. In some ways, I would be surprised if the Supreme Court would absolutely overturn the premises of the Wagner Act, because in a certain sense, referring to your question about the moneyed interests have an interest in preserving a broken law, because in a way it's an entrapment as it fails to work for workers. Removing it might lead to unknown consequences.
No, that's an excellent point. And one of the things that I've been saying is if they do go the full Monty, so to speak,
yes.
And they do take it all away, this may bring back that kind of militancy, that kind of anger of my grandparents' generation, where they were literally tearing this country apart brick by brick. I look at the NLRA as a peace treaty to say, hey, get to the table and hammer this stuff out and stop all of this other stuff. I have friends who are organizers who say, look, the NLRA has been broken for a long time. We don't even bother anymore. So there's a lot of that interest, I think, that could put us in a weird situation in the next several years.
You're absolutely right. And the Wagner Act was a peace treaty in a sense. It was a peace treaty that initially employers weren't anxious to sign. They didn't want the Wagner Act, but they learned to live with it, particularly once they weakened it with the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, and then with subsequent judicial decisions over time that further weakened it. And we should say, Rick, that unfortunately it wasn't always conservatives, it wasn't always Republicans who were behind a lot of those decisions. I've got a good friend, a scholar, Jean-Christian Vanel. He's based in France, who's been studying the liberal courts of Roosevelt appointees in the 40s and 50s, and some of the decisions that they've made that in the end, in the long run, really weakened the Wagner Act. So in a sense, our judiciary, and this has been true for almost all of American history, has never really accepted the legitimacy of workers engaging in collective action. And even some liberals have been meek defenders of that right over time. But now we're in a situation where the law is truly broken. And I do believe that in some ways, keeping the current status quo really works for those who don't like unions. Because as you say, if you tore it down, not only would some of the protections be lost, even though they're not working very well, but some of the restrictions would go as well. Like the Wagner Act, and as modified by the Taft-Hartley Act, prohibits unions from engaging in secondary boycotts.
Yeah. No, my grandfather, I remember stories from my grandfather and his friends who, there was a lot of talk of some interesting things. And there were interesting times of desperation brings desperate outcomes. And, things you might not be proud of to talk about at a dinner party, but, you put food on the table and made sure that the kids had clothes on their back and a roof over their heads. And sadly, given the era that we're in with inflation the way it is and people struggling, could be an interesting time. Now, you mentioned something there. Again, we've talked about the Lochner era here on this program numerous times over the last 19 years. And I get a glazed over look from people when you start talking about this. Because our education system never brings this up. No. And this idea that you have the right to work in horrible conditions for poverty wages, and that was the law of the time, I see raising its ugly head again in this idea of, well, you can be a gig worker and you can make your own deal and you can do all this stuff without understanding that the real power is the moneyed interests who control virtually everything you do. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on where we are and how maybe this idea of liberty of contract or freedom,
Right.
how this plays in the demise of the working class.
Oh, it played a powerful role in the weakening of working class power in the U.S. And, the way you define the Lochner era is exactly right. It was an era when the argument was if the court, or rather if the government tried to set any regulations, anti-child labor, setting a limit for minimum wage or maximum hours, that this would infringe on the right that some workers might want to exercise, to work for less, to work more hours. And that, of course, is an insane way to think about how the real world works. And yet we are seeing an absolute revival of that approach in our legal jurisprudence of late, around things like, as you point out, the gig economy, that people ought to have a right to be exploited by Uber or Lyft if they choose to be. And they don't have a right to collectively come together and bargain for something different because they're not even judged to be employees under the current state of our law.
What's interesting to me, Joseph, is, I've talked to a number of Uber drivers and a number of the gig workers who, they like what they're doing. It gives them freedom. It gives them all these other things. But they got into it because they're like, I don't have anything else.
Right.
So it seems to me that as a country, as we've seen our labor laws broken and the ossification of our labor laws, and as we're seeing employers shifting responsibility onto the backs of workers, as we're seeing this shift, it seems like, the NLRA and any of these other labor laws, they just they're so badly outdated that the new work of this generation, this gig stuff that we're being not sold on, but forced on, that we seriously need a new labor movement and a new legal framework to be able to address this stuff. Don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Next July 5th will mark the 90th anniversary of the signing of the Wagner Act. That act was drafted before there was anything like a gig economy, before there was anything like, much of what the current economy looks like. It was drafted for a different era, and we're still trapped within this aging and decrepit body of law. We desperately need a new set of laws. But one thing I think we have to realize at this point is that, and this is where I think history can be instructive, the Wagner Act came about in large part because of what you referred to about your grandfather and their generation, because they went into the streets and because they engaged in disruption and they demanded change. And for a lot of people in recent years have been hoping we would get a better labor law if we could just elect the right president, if somehow we could shift the composition of the Senate. But I think they, in a way, have it backwards. We're not going to get a new law until workers begin to illustrate that the current one does not work.
Yep. No, I'm with you. Look, the reality is my grandparents and a lot of their generation, they were the generation of the Depression. My grandparents, when they got married the old-fashioned reason. They had to. They started off homeless. And because of, the situation, the times, they fought and in the streets to demand a part of the wealth that their labor created. And because of that labor movement that they built a solidly middle-class existence. They retired with dignity and respect. They died in their home, not wanting for anything. And it's the kind of American story that should be told over and over again, and that should be our birthright and our future. Sadly, we're seeing that not to be the reality.
That's absolutely right. What was accomplished by your grandparents' generation was heroic. Not only did a new legal regime come into play that guaranteed the rights of millions and millions of workers, but they built a powerful labor movement. And over the past generations, we've seen both that structure and that movement eroded.
Yeah,
It has
Joseph,
powerful enemies.
But I argue
Yes.
it's because that they were closer. They were more. Maybe I'm just seeing this in rose-colored eyes, but they were a joiner society. They were
Yes.
They were whether they disagreed, there wasn't a lot that separated them on the work issue. And this is where I've said my hope for President Biden was by strengthening labor, by strengthening the ability to organize, what you're going to get is a way to unite this country. You want to reunite it, reunionize it. Because that generation, they didn't agree on everything or virtually anything, except they wanted to feed their kids. They wanted to put a roof over their head, clothes on their back, and give their kids a better future. And I think every parent today has the exact same views, just not the tools to do what my grandparents' generation were able. So I'm curious, do you see seeds of that? Given the fact that we came out of the pandemic and told how wonderful we were and heroes and essential and all that stuff, do you see that as possible or maybe not?
I'm hopeful, Rick, about this moment, despite all of the horrible things that are going on. And we could go on and on about that right now in many different directions. But I'm hopeful because I spend a lot of time with young people. And among them, I'm really seeing a mood of desire for change and, a realization that it's going to take hard work and organization. And you're right. One of the great benefits of your grandparents' generation was the way work was organized. So many people worked in big factories like the Ford River Rouge, for example, where about 80,000 people worked. You could organize workers more easily in the kind of economy that existed then. We have a challenge in that respect. We also have a challenge, in that you say that was an era of joiners. And, as Robert Putnam has pointed out in his work, Bowling Alone and other books, one thing that's happened over the past generation or two is an atrophy of our communal interactions and the depth of those. So that's going to require some rebuilding. The labor movement is only one of many institutions that are membership institutions that have suffered. But I am optimistic because I see among young people an attitude of we're going to have to take this on and we're going to have to fix this, and a realization that organizing needs to be at the center of it.
There you go. Joseph McCartin, I appreciate your thoughts, your expertise. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again down the road. But good stuff. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rick.
Joseph McCartin's a history professor there at Georgetown University, also the executive director of the Kalmanoff Institute for Labor and the working poor president of LACHA. Quite a resume indeed. I want to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. I'm going to take a quick break. Right back. Stick around.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So the U.S. economy added 206,000 jobs back in June. Unfortunately, our manufacturing sector lost 8,000 jobs in June. And the question is, how'd that happen? I also, in reading through some of the numbers, found that we had a textile industry. And evidently they're going to get hit. They're being hit by this, by what's going on. I didn't know we had a textile industry anymore. Thought we lost that years ago. But here to share some thoughts on the numbers and what this all means, I've asked our good friend Scott Paul, president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, to come share some thoughts. Scott, thanks for taking time for us.
Hey, Rick, it is good to be with you as always, buddy.
Got to tell you, I'm a little surprised we still have a textile industry to lose jobs in. I'm happy that we still have something, but this on the manufacturing side, not great.
Yeah. Yeah, well, first of all, on textiles, because I think people don't realize that because it's behind the scenes. I mean, we make a lot of high-tech textiles in the United States that go into automobiles, fire protection, lots of other stuff. And so, it's not as large as it used to be, but it's still measurable. And the interesting thing, I'll just dive into this, Rick, is that for the textile industry, the challenge has been one of the things I think we're going to talk about, which is China and the garment products that are coming in without tariffs or anything like that under the so-called de minimis rule. And that's been really hurting the textile industry in the United States. Now, overall, more broadly, and you're right, there were 8,000 job losses in manufacturing in June, which sounds dissonant, right, compared to the rest of the economy. And it's primarily because manufacturing is a capital intensive industry, which is money, and money's more expensive. Borrowing costs, interest rates, and so that has hampered some of the manufacturing job growth. This has nothing to do with like congressional policies or Biden administration policies. This is really all about the Federal Reserve and the fact that interest rates are still pretty high, particularly if you're trying to borrow for capital expenses in manufacturing. And that just kind of slows things down. Just one last quick note on the unemployment and manufacturing is that the unemployment rate's ticking back up all over the place, and I do think the Fed really does need to start cutting rates again soon.
Because the fear of inflation is waning. I mean, I think we're moving past. I think we've stabilized. I think now it's maybe let off the brakes a little bit.
I think that's exactly right. And I think the bigger concern is that, we've seen unemployment creep up from 3.7 to 4.1%. And that isn't related to, that's totally related to Fed policies, which, they were designed to cool off the economy. Well, they have. Let's not overshoot it. And in fact, let's get the industries that are kind of most sensitive to interest rates, and that includes manufacturing, kind of like let's get them back into the game. So it's time to start doing that.
Yeah, no, and look, government investment is part of this, I think, as well, and I think some policy as well. I happen to catch this story, and I got to get your thoughts on this because we've talked about this Shein and this Temu, or however you say them. Where you basically go on an app and you think, oh, I'm buying stuff from the guy down the street, and it's coming from China. I've been waiting for the Amazon to do kind of the same thing, and now I see the story that just broke recently that Amazon's going to launch the same kind of discount. I hate to call it a discount store, but the same kind of scheme, if you will, that you see with Temu and Shein. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of like, if you can't beat them, join them, right? And let's get part of the pie that way. And just to take a step back for your listeners, there is there's a feature of customs and trade law called de minimis. And if you've ever left the country, you have to decide one of those customs declarations when you come back in, like how much stuff did you buy? And if it's below a certain threshold, you don't have to pay any taxes or tariffs or customs duties on it. Well, a lot of these retailers found this loophole and are shipping products direct to consumers from China. And since the value is under $800 or whatever, they're able to do this and avoid tariffs. And sometimes the tariffs might be 5%, sometimes they might be 25%, sometimes they might be a lot higher than that, but they don't have to pay any. And that gives them obviously a big price advantage. And the challenge is that this is so unregulated, like these goods aren't subject to inspection. We know from reporting that the supply chains for the goods that are coming through Temu and Shein are pretty horrendous. And so, I'm sorry that instead of pushing back against Temu and Shein, that Amazon is kind of like is now joining forces and is to try to get into that de minimis game as well. What we actually need to have happen is for Congress to change that law. Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, Congressman Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, and others have a bill to do that. And we ought to get that passed, actually, so that there really is a level playing field, because this is hurting businesses as the United States. We talked about that with textiles. Consumers are getting sometimes shoddy products. I mean, this made an SNL skit a few weeks ago, actually, with Jake Gyllenhaal. Yeah. And so it's time that Congress kind of get to this before, this makes, I almost hesitate to say this, Rick, this makes like Walmart look like a good guy, basically.
No, and I was going to say this because look, I'm because as we're talking about this, my mind is going, and when I read this, my mind was going to the place of, you can't blame Amazon for going, we're getting our teeth kicked in. Maybe we should put up our hands and block our face. So there's part of me that goes, they don't have a choice but to join the race to the bottom, or they're going to be extinct. And this is, again, where our dysfunctional Congress can't seem to protect us from something that glaringly is obvious to everyone should be stopped, but we can't seem to get something this simple done.
Yeah. And I think the challenge is that, is twofold. Number one, there are some interests who obviously oppose this. Shein, Temu, some of these.
And I care about them not at all.
Yeah. Amazon. So that's number one. Number two is that, the way Congress works, unfortunately, and particularly for some, it's like, well, if we give this de minimis, what are you going to give us in terms of like free trade agreements or whatever? And so it becomes part of the horse trading when, if you just, put it for an up or down vote, it would pass overwhelmingly, right? Because it's about justice and it is, it's aimed at China. And so it should pass overwhelmingly if it was given a chance.
See, for me, this falls into the very simple realm of where I am a protectionist. You need to protect your domestic industries. You need to protect the jobs that people need in your community and your economy. I'm not an isolationist. I don't say build a giant moat, but we do need to protect domestic interests. And this just seems, when you said that Walmart seems like the good guy in this, wow, we're scraping the bottom of that so-called barrel.
Yeah, you're right. And just by the way, Walmart still has a long way to go, but they just announced a partnership with American Giant, which does all American T-shirts, and they're going to be sold in Walmart stores. So count me as surprised, right? But I think they realize at least the power of projecting that made in USA label.
Well, wasn't that weren't they the first one to do it? Wasn't Sam Walton the guy who was out there with all of the Made in America signs, even though the stuff was made somewhere else?
Yeah, a generation ago, they were all into it until they figured out they could make higher margins by getting their suppliers to go offshore, and they would rake in all the profits, even though it would devastate the communities that had the factories at one time. But
Byron Dorgan, former Senator Byron Dorgan, wrote a book on this years ago. We interviewed him on it. He went through product after product, iconic American brands that because of Walmart are now made in China or more basically extinct now. But I seem to remember that. So on this last question I've got on this, how do we push this? Because I think most people would agree. Maybe we should have the protections of U.S. law. Maybe we should have the protections of environmental policy and consumer policies on the products coming into the country, and maybe not just have this open pipeline into the U.S. from the communist Chinese folks there. What should we do?
Yeah, well, I think that the easiest thing for listeners to do and the best thing is to call their member of Congress and to urge them to support the Blumenauer de minimis reform bill, and to put pressure on them to do that, and also to make sure that Temu, Shein can't do file to go public in the United States. That would be a huge mistake that would open up equity markets to them. I think that would be a big mistake. And also to understand that because of this loophole that we're talking about, this is a pathway for fentanyl to get in the United States. It's been well documented as well. So it's not just hurting manufacturing in the United States. It's actually the de minimis loophole is contributing to the opioid challenge that we're seeing in a lot of communities now. So there's so many reasons to stop this, but we gotta push back, because as we just discussed, there's some powerful interests that like things the way they are, unfortunately.
I know I said last question, but it just popped into my head, because what I still don't seem to understand is how how these Shimu and Timu and whatever, Shamu or whatever, how they're able to send this stuff to the U.S., pay the shipping cost, have the products cost, all that stuff, and ship it here to the U.S. for pennies. Look, my son bought a bunch of funnels for gas cans. He got like 15 of them, and it was like $3. Shipped direct from China to our door for like $3. I can barely send an envelope across the country for $3, and yet somehow we're getting finished products. Now it's garbage, but it's still finished product that you'd buy in a store for $3 delivered to your house. How are they doing that?
Well, as that SNL sketch said you actually don't want to know how they're doing it. So it's the answer is not a good one, and it's all about labor exploitation, and it's about shoddy craftsmanship and the materials that are being used. Again, these things aren't subject to inspection, and they also get a shipping deal that makes it surprisingly affordable for them to ship it from China. And so, yeah, you scratch your head. You're like, how did we make this so easy? And yeah, I mean, like teenagers, they don't have the fully formed brain yet, so they're going to be like, this is a great thing to do. I know, we all have kids like that, and so this is where there is a role for policy to say, hey, we need to both preserve jobs in the United States, protect our consumers, prevent the flow of fentanyl coming in, and have a level playing field for retailers that are actually doing the right thing and at least paying the tariff rates. So let's get this done.
Yeah. No, because on these things, you can't even buy these things in the U.S. is what the problem is. It's the reason he went to Temu for them, because here in the U.S. you can't have a gas can with a nozzle on it. It doesn't have some kind of block, some kind of flow restriction. And this is just like the old school, like we remember as kids. You put a hose on there and it pours out. You can't even buy those here. So, not only are you getting, shoddy stuff that, is going through all things, it's going against U.S. policy as well. So it is what it is. I got to get your thoughts on this story I saw over at the Wall Street Journal. That evidently U.S. car makers, foreign car makers, like Germany and others, are losing market share in China because of the EVs, because China is going EV. Their policy is that's where they're gonna dominate. And there's a chance that these companies like GM, who invested billions of dollars in China, they're gonna get all of that investment wiped out. Do we feel sorry for them?
Not really. I mean, you can see the writing on the wall here. And look, I get it. If you want to be in a market and you want to sell to a large market like China, it makes a lot of sense to locate a factory there and do it. I think we're all for localization. We talk about it all the time for the U.S. market.
Yep.
Like if you're going to sell into China, sure, I guess you want to set up I guess it's okay to set up a factory there. But what happened? They also gave the keys to their technology to all of these Chinese companies, right? And the know-how and what have you. And then the Chinese government at the same time, literally in its 5-year plan policy, so this wasn't a secret, said we want to build up our own auto industries and we're going to use tech transfers and joint ventures and all of that to do that. So they have successfully done that. Geely, BYD, NIO, SAIC, there's a bunch of these companies that are quite large now and becoming globally competitive. And so the Chinese government is putting the squeeze on the automakers like GM, Ford, Stellantis, and their market share is going to shrink someday to zero. And so, yeah, their best days in China are over. I think the only silver lining in all of this is that most of these companies realize there's a threat from Chinese EVs coming into the U.S. market, and are either supporting or at least not opposing policies to put big tariffs on EVs coming from China, because it threatens obviously their global market share, but more specifically their market share in the United States, and that means factory jobs here.
No, absolutely. And it means, a major hit to our economy. Now, I also saw an article over at Fortune that said that, right now, as we're talking about this, you've got self-driving cars, Chinese self-driving cars here in the U.S. racking up, a couple million miles, and also, gathering information with cameras and all kinds of stuff. We had the balloon. Everyone was freaked out about the balloon. But now you got these EVs running around. Is this something we should be worried about? Something we should be taking some action on? Is it something we can be worried and take action on?
Yeah, this is absolutely something that we should be worried about. And the idea that these Chinese companies have cars that collect all sorts of data, and be answerable to the government in Beijing is a threat. The Congress realizes that, the administration realizes that, the Commerce Department has proposed a rule that would basically restrict connected vehicles in the United States that are manufactured by companies based in quote unquote entities of concern, right? And entities of concern are China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, basically.
So can we add California to that? Because isn't that where Teslas are made? Because I got to be honest, I was thinking about this. I'm going, Chinese Communist government, Elon Musk.
Right. Well, you don't want anyone to utilize that data as a threat, but the issue has been that with the autonomous vehicles, they're going around collecting data. Think about drone, like 80% of the commercial drone market in the United States is supplied by Chinese companies, and that data goes back. And in fact, we know from research that I think for NEOs, 90% of the data that they're collecting is actually going back to Beijing in some way. So it's not like even if they said, oh, no, we're going to keep the data here, that's not the way it works. And by the way, this is why TikTok got banned, right? This is exactly why TikTok got banned. And it's a social media app, right? And so if you think a social media app is a security threat to the United States, you should certainly think that connected vehicles, whether they're autonomous, drones, or passenger vehicles, also the Chinese brands ought to be banned from the United States as well, Rick.
For a whole bunch of reasons, obviously the security risk part of it, and obviously the attack on our economy. But yet, I wanted you to finish up on this point because I get emails weekly from people going, "We should allow the Chinese EVs in so we can move to electric vehicles quicker. We can, there's this view that somehow this is going to save the planet if we all move to EVs, and I'm not sold on that." But I'm certainly not sold on the idea that moving faster with Chinese EVs is going to help us get to that place either.
No, destroying 3% of America's gross domestic product is not going to help solve climate change. It's going to create political and economic chaos in the United States. It's going to reduce support for climate initiatives. We need to have this American made. And it may take, honestly, a few months longer and cost a little bit more. But in the end, it's going to be worth it because we're going to own the technology. We're going to have the jobs. We're going to build out the ecosystem. We're going to do it the right way.
There you go.
And instead of the Shein or Temu way, which we don't want to Shein and Temu our way to climate. That's not going to work. We know it's not going to work. It's a terrible idea.
Can you imagine that day where, Shein Motors or Temu Motors sends you an EV for like $20 and you got those bumping around on the road? I don't know. But Scott, as always, I appreciate the time. Great stuff. Look forward to talking to you again real soon.
As always, Rick, great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Our good friend Scott Paul. Want to hear your thoughts. This race to the bottom, are we in? Is cheap goods, is that more important than stable economy or, well, for my red hat friends, borders? I want to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Right back. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1918. That was the day that went down in U.S. history as the Great Train Wreck. The wreck occurred at Dutchman's Curve in Nashville, Tennessee. During World War I, the train industry was bustling across the nation. Trains carried troops as well as workers to factories to support the war effort. On that fateful morning, the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway No. 1 train was heading east to Nashville from Memphis. One of the passengers on that train was George Scott. At 18 years old, George was traveling to the DuPont plant to make gunpowder for the war. He was just one of many workers on the train heading to work at the plant. The number 4 train was traveling west. Both of the trains were running late. As the number 4 train approached Dutchman's Curve, it received an all-clear signal from the signal tower. But then, the tower switched the signal to a red stop warning. It was too late. The train was barreling ahead on a collision course with the number 1 train. At 7:20 a.m., the two trains collided head-on at a rate of speed between 50 and 60 miles an hour. 101 people were killed. 171 more were injured. It was the deadliest train disaster in U.S. history. The young George Scott recalled the horrible scene, saying, "I had to raise up the window, and the glass was falling all over everywhere. And I finally got out of there, and I wandered out past a cornfield, best I can remember, and I run across one of the trainmen lying there." In the aftermath of the tragedy, thousands of people helped in the rescue effort. Today's Labor History in 2 brought to you in memory of Carol Hillman, a passionate friend of workers and volunteer of the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
You're listening to The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.
So we're going to make child labor great again. Look, the Supreme Court gets their way, we're going to gut all of that stuff. And, because look, kids got small hands. They can get their hands into small places. When quarters fall down between the register and the counter, they can get their hands in there and get it out. They can do intricate little things. School, who needs school? So I came across the Department of Labor press release from yesterday. And McDonald's, there are a couple of franchisees in Kentucky that were targeted. Look, you can't inspect everyone across the country. So you got to think all of them on some level are breaking child labor laws because we need cheap labor. Now, what they came across, 3 of these McDonald's franchisees, because understand the mastery of McDonald's. They don't own many of the restaurants that have their name on them. They contract them out to someone else. So you go and you become a franchisee and you pay them a boatload of money. But anything that you do, they're not responsible for. So, if you're abusing child labor, if you're cheating people out of wages, if you're creating horrible work environment, fine, but don't mess with the French fries. No, you can't get your own oil or your own potatoes or find different buns or napkins. No, all of that you got to get from on high. But all of the labor abuses, we didn't see it. So am I surprised that in Kentucky you find 10-year-olds working as late as 2 a.m.? No, not really. Am I surprised that you're finding kids younger than 14 working in the restaurant where they're not really supposed to, beyond the hours that they're allotted? No. Am I surprised that the one had 24 minors under the age of 16 working more than the legally permitted hours? No, not even a little bit. Am I surprised that another one had, which controls 27 locations in the area, allowed 242 minors between 14 and 15 to work beyond the allowable hours, and also, play with some dangerous stuff? Are we surprised that, you got 14-year-olds operating the dangerous stuff? 10-year-olds operating the fryers? Are we surprised by that? And the answer is no. And the thing is, the fine's pathetic. These are 3 franchisees who are making a huge amount of money, but the 3 of them with 305 minors, including 10-year-olds, $212,000 in fines. And again, I go back to where I started today's program. We don't have the kind of penalties that actual human citizens, that actual persons have. Because if a person did this, they would probably go to jail. Child abuse. But a corporation, don't do it again. Say you won't. Post a notice. We understand federal child labor laws are very clear. Work must be performed outside of school hours. Can't work during school time. You can't work more than 3 hours on a school day, including Fridays. No more than 8 hours on a non-school day. No more than 18 hours during the school week. No more than 40 hours during a non-school week. Seems simple. Can't work between anything past 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., except between June 1st and Labor Day, which they extend that to 9 p.m. These are simple, not hard to follow, unless addicted to the child labor heroin that our employers seem to be. And, for me, I got to tell you, this is a time where parents, like me, because my kids work, need to ensure that our kids aren't abused, because I'm a big supporter of kids learning the value of $1 and learning responsibility of showing up on time and work ethic and all that, but not to be exploited. And sadly, we've got too many states that are looking to roll a lot of this stuff back. So this election, again, another little thing to be thinking about. Want to hear your thoughts? Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. You okay with 10-year-olds frying up your fries? I want to hear it. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Questions, comments, something in your mind. Want to hear it? Miss any of the program, grab the podcast. And as always, thanks so much for being here. We'll see you back here next time.
You've been listening to The Rick Smith Show. Email Rick at rick@thericksmithshow.com. Until next time, this has been The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.